In the history of punishment, some methods were designed to kill the body. Others were designed to destroy the mind. But few were as systematic and as invisible as Jianfeng, known only to a few and feared by all. Unlike executions that bled in public squares, Jianfeng didn't leave marks on the skin. It left them in memory, practiced discreetly during the late Qing dynasty. It wasn't a sentence, it was a condition. The accused were not executed. They were assigned to a room, one without windows, one with a single low light, and they stayed there, not for hours, for years. There was no trial, no witness, no defense. A ledger recorded their number, not their name. Meals came through a slot. Light was controlled. Sleep cycles were erased. There were no guards inside, only silence. Sometimes the prisoners sang to stay sane. Other times they stopped speaking altogether. Death wasn't the sentence. Forgetting who you were, that was. It was used on political threats, dissenters, family members who refused marriage alliances, and scholars who wrote the wrong things. No one ever saw the rooms, but stories survived. One former servant spoke about trays left untouched for days. Another described the rooms as cold, but not from temperature. When foreign observers came, they were shown prisons. But Jianfeng wasn't part of any official map. There were no photos, only rumors, and a few recovered journal pages, written in shaking hands, found decades later. Jianfeng didn't need a blade. It didn't need an audience, because it proved something more terrifying. That silence could be just as loud as violence. In ancient East Asia, a person had to die intact. If the body was damaged, the spirit was believed to fracture. That's what made Jiqi worse. It was not just punishment. It was erasure, in this world and the next. Jiqi was rarely discussed openly, not because it was rare, but because it was shameful, even to those who used it. It involved the removal of one part of the body, always chosen symbolically. A scholar, the tongue; a thief, the hands; a soldier, the feet. Sometimes they were removed while alive, sometimes after death. Either way, the effect was the same. The family could not bury the body as a whole. The soul, according to belief, would wander incomplete in the afterlife. One of the first voices to question this was Han Jiang, a failed monk-turned-archivist. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't noble. But he collected things. He recorded each case quietly, hidden under agricultural logs. He wrote down victims' names, the missing parts, the silence afterward. He died unknown, but his scrolls were discovered centuries later, and they told a darker story. By the early Ming period, Jiqi became methodical. One name, Zhao Lin, appeared 37 times. The same executioner, the same signature. Across 20 years, one record stood out. A woman named Weiyan, accused of disobedience. Punishment, removal of vocal cords. No trial, just silence. She lived for 11 more years. Never spoke again. Not by choice, by design. Her grave marker simply read, mute. That was Jiqi. Not a spectacle, not a crowd. Just quiet removal. Of body, of name, of place in the world. After the collapse of the Eastern Kingdom, records began to resurface, and with them, names that had been erased. One of them was Ren Dao, a general executed under false charges. Decades later, an archivist uncovered sealed military logs, proving his innocence. A formal apology was written, but he was already dust. Still, some believed this was closure. But what came next was not redemption. It was escalation. In 1591, under Emperor Lingchi, a new system of purification was introduced. It was called Shuijing, translated loosely as the clean silence. It began as a secret ritual, only for traitors, only for women. It involved blood, but not bloodletting. Girls between ages 12 and 16 were selected for spiritual refining. They were forced to fast, to drink melted snow, to wear silk soaked in lime. The purpose? To cleanse them from impure lineage. If they coughed, they were caned. If they bled, they were expelled. If they resisted, they disappeared. Eventually, 13 of them plotted escape. They never made it. One of them, Lien Fei, was caught trying to write a letter. She was not executed. She was silenced, tongue removed, hands bound, eyes covered. The others were punished with a variation of Qiuxin, removal of heart, post-mortem. Their families were enslaved or vanished. When foreign advisors entered the court during the 10th Scroll Accord, they weren't told of this, but whispers grew. One French translator, Marcel Barrett, accidentally uncovered restricted medical scrolls. In a temple near Xi'an, he copied fragments. What he found was enough. He published them abroad under the title, Instruments of Quiet Death. It caused uproar, not in China, but in Europe, where diplomats began questioning everything. One of the most vocal was Sir Edward Fenn, a British legal advisor stationed in Janning. He sent 27 letters, each one demanding reform, each one ignored, until 1863, when an American physician documented the bruises on a surviving girl and published her account in a London journal. They called her Subject 019. Her real name never recorded, but her scars became evidence. And for the first time, what was hidden became undeniable. But the court remained silent. Reform requests were ignored. No admission, no denial. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the first Western documents on Jiqi appeared. In 1894, a Dutch medical officer named Peter Lang published a field report. He had been stationed at a border facility near the northern provinces. His report wasn't public, but it circulated privately among physicians. The next year, 1895, two more names emerged: Dr. Helena Griggs, a Canadian nurse, and Oswald Myers, a German cartographer. Neither witnessed Jiqi firsthand, but both described its effects in detail. Scar patterns, speech loss, behavioral symptoms like light aversion and spatial disorientation. But no photos, only sketches. And those, too, were confiscated later. That changed in 1900, after the uprising. When foreign troops entered the inner zones, they found more than weapons. They found rooms, bare, cold, marked with single numbers and faint stains on the floor. Some soldiers took photographs. Most were undeveloped or destroyed. One survived, taken by a French infantryman named Louis Charcot. It showed a man, seated, arms bound behind a frame, eyes open, lips sewn. No one knew his name, only the number carved into the wood above his head, 0267. In 1903, a student named Wei Tsen published a banned essay. It was titled, Silence is Not Peace. He compared Jiqi to sanctioned torture. The authorities detained him. He vanished 6 days later. The pressure mounted. Whispers spread into embassies. And by 1905, under intense internal and external scrutiny, two figures stepped forward: Minister Shen Ru, a reformist bureaucrat, and Wu Lin Hai, a former magistrate turned educator. They called Jiqi a betrayal of cultural values, a weapon used to erase, not discipline. In March 1905, an internal memo was circulated. All isolation chambers must be sealed. No new entries authorized. But 2 weeks later, in a forgotten corridor of Yongling Prison, prisoner 0441 was subjected to the last known procedure. His name was Daru, a watchman accused of tampering with records. No trial, no confession, just a final act. Quiet, unrecorded, like the ones before. Despite internal objections, the final chamber was activated. The seal had been signed, but silence wasn't enforced yet. And this time, someone documented everything. 12 photographs were taken, each labeled, time-stamped, categorized, then printed into state-issued cards. Not as evidence, but as instruction. These were distributed in the city of Genie, sold in bookstores, traded in tea shops, mailed as tokens of imperial strength. They weren't hidden. They were endorsed. Western diplomats found them months later. Some thought they were propaganda, but the paper, the ink, the signatures, all official. And that's how the outside world learned about Jiqi's final breath. March 1905. A reform edict. A small signature. An empire's last legal cruelty. The edict didn't arrive suddenly. It followed decades of resistance. Quiet papers, hidden scrolls, private testimony. One of the loudest voices came from Shenru, a legal minister who rewrote the structure of Qing jurisprudence. He argued that disfigurement was no longer compatible with modern nationhood. Alongside him was Wu Linhai, a diplomat who had studied British penal systems. They said, a civilized empire does not practice surgical humiliation. But as mentioned before, words don't erase systems instantly. On April 13, 1905, exactly 2 weeks after abolition, Subject 0471, a border guard named Daru, was silenced using the very method now outlawed. Cameras were present again. 12 photos. Same angles. Same framing. But this time, the images carried no signature. They were leaked. Printed. Studied. Not for justice, for curiosity. Zhiqi was gone from the law. But it wasn't gone. By 1911, the empire collapsed. A republic rose. And legal modernization began. But in remote provinces, where local councils answered to no one, silent rooms remained. Unofficial. Unwritten. Still used. The logic was familiar. Some crimes deserve memory loss. Some wrongs, they said, could not end with a clean blade. This wasn't punishment. This was performance. And the people watching believed. That pain was justice. That silence was order. Even now, psychologists and historians refer to Zhiqi in new terms. Layered punishment. Social deletion. Memory erasure by confinement. It is no longer law, but it still lingers, in places where power prefers shadows. And yet, the record shows, there were always people who said no, from forgotten monks like Han Jiang, to reformers like Shenru. There were those who preserved names, so they would not vanish with the body. And that's the irony of punishment. It never starts with justice. It starts with control. And sometimes, what survives longer than the law is the silence that followed it. Zhiqi was more than a method. It was a message. One that said, fear is safer than fairness. But even in that fear, there were names. People who refused to stay silent. Some were erased. Some recorded quietly. Some buried evidence in temple walls, so that truth wouldn't vanish with the next dynasty. And that's what makes history matter. Not the wounds, but the ones who refused to accept them as normal. Zhiqi didn't just strip a person of their body. It tried to erase their identity. And that's why it had to end. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in showing what happens when power has no limits. When we study these systems, it isn't to condemn a culture. It's to remind ourselves that justice dies when pain becomes routine, and dignity begins where cruelty ends. If this story made you pause, if it opened even a small door into the machinery of forgotten punishment, then let it stay with you. Because remembering is the only thing that ever ends. What power tries to repeat